Okay, so my name's Peyton Flowers. I decided to write my literature review on burnout in ICU nurses. I think there's burnout in all aspects of nursing, but I think ICU nurses pretty much get the brunt of it, but we don't see it as often because we're not paying attention to the signs. So that's what my presentation is about. So Okay, so I chose to talk about burnout in ICU nursing for the main fact because I do want to be a critical care nurse. I've always had a passion to work on an ICU floor, preferably like a CVICU, because I do like caring for the sickest of the sick patients. Um, I like the challenging scenarios, and I'm really big on critical thinking, and I would like to think that I'm really good at it. But it did kind of scare me when I started reading articles about burnout in ICU nursing because there is such a high turnover rate on it. And I didn't really realize why there was until I did all this research and realized it's because the lead nurses on the floor, they don't really care about how the ICU nurses are feeling. They don't really care that maybe a death of one of their patients is really affecting them because they've grown close with them over their past 3 shifts just that week. I do believe that there's not enough resources available for nurses in the ICU specifically. And by that, I mean there's not enough mental health people available. There's not enough mandatory debriefing meetings. And that's something I do believe needs to be addressed. And it was crazy because that was a lot of what I found in these articles was that mandatory debriefing should be required for ICU nurses especially. They do get the sickest of the sick in the hospital. Generally, if you're on an ICU floor, you're vented, you're intubated. You can't really do anything on your own, and that's what these nurses are there for. I did also notice that a lot of ICU floors are supposed to be 1-to-1, but it seems like more of them are 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and it shouldn't be like that because these are really sick patients who need the critical care on them. They don't need to be bombarded with all these other situations. They need to have one nurse with one patient. It doesn't really seem like it's like that. And really, I decided to talk about burnout in the ICU because I feel like a lot of nurses that are in the ICU just eventually lose their love for nursing. Um, the girl that I did interview, which I will tell you about in just a second, she was an ICU nurse, and that's the main thing she discussed was she lost her passion for nursing. She went into nursing school with the mindset that she wanted to be an ICU nurse. She was going to start an ICU nurse, leave an ICU nurse, and she said it just wasn't the same. And I think that's what really stinks because I do have my heart set on that, and the fact that that could be a possibility for me that I will end up losing the love for nursing kind of scares me. So I interviewed Tori Georges. She is my lead nurse at Nebraska Medical Center. She used to be an ICU nurse, and she is now the nurse manager on the pre-op PACU floor. She was an ICU nurse for only 2 years when she finally just got burnt out, and she just had many scenarios that happened back to back to back, and then it seemed like the leads on her floor didn't care about her, didn't care about her feelings, didn't care that her mental health was deteriorating, which was causing her to lose the passion she had for nursing. So with that, I will tell you about my articles. So my first article is by Sharida and Ashkatab. This one mainly discussed the relationship between ICU nurses with moral distress and burnout. These two authors decided that burnout does go hand in hand with turnover, and that was what the ending finding was. So they figured out that the burnout outcomes are just as dangerous as moral distress. So moral distress is that these nurses are being told to do something that they really don't feel comfortable doing, but they feel like since a higher up is telling them to do it, they have no say in it. And since ICU is so rush, 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 there's no time to really debate because if you do wait 5 minutes, something really bad could happen to this patient. So they just do it and ending up not liking what they're doing. They're feeling like they're not giving the best care they should be. And that leads to burnout. It was also both the caregiver and the person receiving the care are affected. So that's kind of self-explanatory. If the nurse is affected by being stressed out, not having the mental capacity available, that's affecting the care that nurse is giving to the patient. And ultimately, that could ruin someone's life. That could risk someone's life. And moral distress affects nurses' mentality and can lead to frustration, which can cause them to make med errors, cause them to give something to the wrong patient, cause them to do something to a patient by accident or just out of frustration, which again, in conclusion, leads to nurse burnout, which leads to high turnover rates, and then it's just a rolling cycle. So the findings I found from that article were that ICUs are recruiting new grad nurses more than ever before. And this is because they think the new grads won't get burnt out as easily because they do like the rush. Little do they know they do get burnt out. They realize that older nurses in the ICU experience more moral distress. And I think that's because older nurses, they've been around the block. They know what they're supposed to be doing. They know that that's not right. And new nurses, I think, are kind of more afraid to say no to a higher power, when in reality, yeah, you should. That's what we're taught in nursing school, is if something's not right, speak up. You need to advocate. And I think when you get on a critical care floor, it's different. So my second article was by Nicola Griffith. In this article, she basically discussed how nurses are basically told to have a suck it up mentality and how that needs to change. And that's really all I have to say about this article, is that they do. Nurses are told to suck stuff up. You chose this career path. This is what you wanted. People have it worse. No, we shouldn't be told to suck it up. If something's wrong, we should be told we can speak up. Basically, this Miss Griffith went through a traumatizing event on her floor. She ended up losing a patient, was just really distressed about the whole situation, and she went to her lead, and instead of her lead referring her to like a mental health person, they just moved her to day shift so they could keep an eye on her, and she felt like that wasn't very right. She didn't feel like they took the right actions for it. This article, the findings of it were that nurses were taught not to complain about things, but then by not complaining about things, they aren't talking about what bothers them at all, and that's going to affect the care. The information the person I interviewed, Tori Georges, gave me about this is that she suggested tips for that staff need to be taught about burnout. Look for exhaustion, look for depersonalization of coworkers and patients, and look for reduced personal accomplishment. Do they like being there? Are they the same? Are they not giving their 100% to that patient? And then my last article was by Fonseca and Mello. This was about burnout syndrome among nurses in the ICU. So this article kind of encompassed what my entire paper was about. It talked about constant exposure to painful situations, such as patients with terminal conditions, patients that are in really critical scenarios, patients that have been in trauma and they're in the ICU. That's what these nurses are exposed to. They're not exposed to watching a patient just get a quick surgery and be out of there. No, these patients are in there for a long time, and some of them don't come out. And these prolonged exposure to these stressful events leads to a higher burnout rate than it would on like a med-surg floor or an ortho floor. And it leads these nurses to just leave and not want to come back again, and potentially not want to come back to nursing. The findings I found from that article were that ICU nurses were working upwards of 50 hours a week with all the extra education and handoff of the patient. The handoff of these ICU patients takes 20 to 25 minutes a patient versus a regular med-surg patient takes 10 minutes. So they're staying all these extra hours, go home, sleep, play with their family, eat, come right again. So it's just like back to back. And then the burden and demands of the job put the ICU nurse to be in a higher risk category for burnout. And that's just, that explains itself. Nurses that work in an ICU, they have more burdens, they have more demands, they have more orders. It's constant orders coming in. And I think that causes a really high risk of burnout. So that's the end of my PowerPoint. Like I said, that's why I chose to do burnout in the ICU, is because I do plan on being an ICU nurse one day, and I really didn't want to let these articles sway my decisions, but after reading them, I do have to say that it does make you think a little bit. So I hope you enjoyed.